Did you know that the word palace in English, and similar words in many other languages, comes from a hill in Rome? The Palatine Hill, home to emperors and the elite of ancient Rome, gave its name Palatium to the grand residences built upon it. Today, we use palace to describe the homes of royalty and heads of state around the world. But Palatine Hill is just one of Rome's famed 7 hills. Along with Capitoline, Aventine, Caelian, Esquiline, Viminal, and Quirinal, these hills have witnessed the rise and fall of one of history's greatest empires. To the ancient Romans, these hills weren't just geographical features, they were the very essence of their city and its destiny. Each hill had its own personality, its own gods, and its own role in Roman society. The Romans believed that building their city on 7 hills was a sign of divine favor, mirroring the 7 hills of ancient Athens. These hills weren't just where Rome was built, they were why Rome was great. It all started with 2 infant boys, abandoned and left for dead. A she-wolf finds them and nurses them back to health in a cave. As you may already know, those boys were Romulus and Remus, the legendary founders of Rome, and that cave was on Palatine Hill. Legend has it that these twins, sons of the god Mars, were ordered to be drowned by their great uncle, but fate had other plans. The river carried them to safety, where they were found and nursed by said she-wolf. Eventually they were discovered and raised by a simple shepherd. When they grew up and learned of their true identity, they decided to found a city by the banks of the Tiber River. And that's where the story took somewhat of a dark turn. The brothers argued over which hill to build their city on. Romulus chose the Palatine, Remus preferred the Aventine. They agreed to let the gods decide through augury, the observation of birds. Romulus saw more birds, claimed victory, and began to build a wall around Palatine Hill. Remus, in a fit of anger or perhaps jest, leaped over the partially built wall to mock his brother. Romulus, enraged, killed his brother on the spot, declaring, "So perish everyone who shall leap over my walls." And thus, Rome was founded on brotherly blood and solid walls. But Palatine Hill isn't just the birthplace of Rome's origin, it's essentially Beverly Hills of the ancient world. If you were of real importance in ancient Rome, this is where you lived. Imagine mansions so grand they'd make modern billionaires jealous. We're talking sprawling complexes with hundreds of rooms, private stadiums, and gardens that would put the hanging gardens of Babylon to shame. And as mentioned in the intro, the word palace comes from this very hill. Take the Domus Augustana. Finished in 92 AD, this became the official residence of the Roman emperors for about 300 years. A building covering multiple acres in 2 levels. The ground floor was for official business, while the upper floor was the emperor's private residence and various residential rooms. It had its own stadium, multiple courtyards, and even a private basilica. Why did the emperors choose to live right here? The answer probably lies in the hill's mythical status. By living on Palatine Hill, emperors weren't just choosing the best real estate, they were placing themselves in the footsteps of Romulus, claiming a divine right to rule. It was a powerful statement. I am the successor of Rome's founder, chosen by the gods to lead. You've probably heard the phrase, Rome wasn't built in a day, and on Palatine Hill you can clearly see why. Archaeologists have found layer upon layer of buildings, each generation building on top of the last. These layers tell the story of Rome's evolution. From humble Iron Age huts to lavish imperial palaces, Palatine Hill is a vertical timeline of Roman history. It's a testament to Rome's endurance and its constant reinvention of itself. As we leave Palatine Hill, remember, this is where Rome began, with a myth, a murder, and a dream of greatness. But to understand how that dream became a reality, we need to climb our next hill, where the gods themselves held court. Welcome to Capitoline Hill, the brain of ancient Rome. If Palatine Hill was where emperors lived, Capitoline Hill was where they, and everyone else, prayed and politicked. Towering over the city was the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. Optimus Maximus means the best and greatest, and this temple lived up to the name. It was the ancient equivalent of the Vatican, the White House, and Fort Knox, all rolled into one. There were gleaming marble columns, a gilded roof catching the sunlight, and at the center, a gold and ivory statue of Jupiter himself, king of the gods. It wasn't just a place of worship, it was a statement. It screamed, Rome is the greatest city in the world and we've got the gods on our side. Imagine you're a victorious Roman general. You've just conquered new lands for Rome, and now it's time for your triumph. A grand parade through the city. Where does this parade end? Right here, at the Temple of Jupiter. You'd climb the steps, come face to face with the king of the gods, and offer thanks for your victory. I imagine this would somewhat humble the proud conqueror. But Capitoline Hill wasn't only about the gods, it was also the seat of earthly power. This is the tabularium, built in the late Republican era, functioned as the Roman equivalent of the National Archives. Every law, every treaty, every important document was stored here. It was the central library and statistical office of the Roman government. Imagine rows upon rows of scrolls containing vital information about the running of the empire, tax records, military reports, diplomatic correspondence, and so on. The tabularium was so important that it was one of the few buildings to survive the fall of Rome almost intact. The name of the United States Capitol building was inspired by Capitoline Hill and the architecture, as well as location, heavily inspired by the Pantheon, among other notable Roman buildings. But Capitoline Hill wasn't all pomp and ceremony. It had a dark side too. See that cliff? That's the infamous Tarpeian Rock. If you were convicted of treason in ancient Rome, this is where you'd meet your maker, by being thrown off the edge. It gives a literal meaning to the phrase falling from grace, I guess. Imagine being led to this spot. It was a brutal punishment, but also a powerful deterrent. The symbolic message was clear: betray Rome, and you'll fall from the very heart of the city. As we leave Capitoline Hill, ponder this. From this one hill, you could speak to the gods, govern an empire, and eliminate your enemies. It was the nexus of divine and earthly power in Rome. But what about ordinary men and women? Where did they find their voice? For that, we need to head to our next hill, where the people made history. So let's leave the world of emperors and gods and dive into the story of the common people. Welcome to Aventine Hill, the birthplace of representation of ordinary people in ancient Rome. Imagine you're a plebeian in ancient Rome, which statistically you would be. You're tired of being pushed around by the patricians, the upper class. You can't hold political office. You're drowning in debt, and you have no say in the laws that govern your life. What do? If you're living in 494 BC, you pack up and leave the city en masse, heading for Aventine Hill. This wasn't a riot. It was the first secession of the plebs, a peaceful protest that shook Rome to its core. The plebeians essentially said, if you won't give us rights, we'll start our own city. And it worked. The result was the creation of the tribune of the plebs, a fairly powerful government position that gave common citizens a voice in Roman politics. It was somewhat like the Roman equivalent of congressional representation and the ombudsman. The tribunes had the power to suggest laws, as well as veto laws and actions of magistrates that threatened the plebeians. They were considered sacrosanct, meaning it was a serious crime to harm its members. I think it would be hard to exaggerate how monumental of a win this was. Despite the eventual reduction of their power, the creation of this office marked a critical step towards political protection for the plebeian class. And Aventine Hill wasn't done making history. In 456 BC, the Lex Aecilia was passed, granting plebeians the right to build homes on the Aventine. Suddenly, Aventine Hill became a symbol of plebeian pride and independence. It was their hill, their home base, and from here, they continued to push for more rights. Over the next couple of centuries, the plebeians, often using Aventine Hill as their base, won several victories. They gained the right to marry patricians, to hold high office, and eventually to see the laws as binding on all Romans. It was a slow process, but it fundamentally changed Roman society, at least for some time. Whenever someone tells me protesting never works, I like to remind them of Aventine Hill. Sometimes to make your voice heard, you've got to head for the hills. But Aventine wasn't just about politics. As with everything Roman, it had a spiritual side too. The hill was home to temples of foreign gods and the gods of the lower classes, like the Temple of Diana, which became a center of the plebeian religious life. There was also the Temple of Ceres, goddess of the harvest, fitting for a hill associated with the common people. But now, let's head to a hill that saw a different kind of transformation, from humble beginnings to imperial grandeur. Let's take a stroll to Caelian Hill, where Rome's elite made their mark. In the early days of Rome, Caelian Hill was likely a modest settlement. According to legend, it was incorporated into Rome by Tullus Hostilius, Rome's third king. He is said to have settled people from Alba Longa here after conquering that city. As Rome grew from a small city-state into the capital of an empire, Caelian Hill's fortunes grew too. By the late Republic, it had become prime real estate. It was a neighborhood where every house is a mansion, and every garden could host a small army. This was the place to be if you were rich and wanted everyone to know it. Picture a villa with mosaic floors depicting scenes from mythology, walls painted in vibrant frescoes, and a garden filled with exotic plants from all corners of the empire. These weren't just homes, they were statements of wealth and power. The real star on Caelian Hill, however, was the Temple of Claudius, started by Emperor Claudius's wife in commemoration of her deified husband. This massive structure dominated the hill's landscape. It was a temple so grand it could probably be seen from across the city, its columns reaching towards the sky, representing imperial power and divine favour. Caelian Hill wasn't just about luxury, though. It also played a crucial role in Rome's intelligence operations. The Castra Peregrina functioned as the headquarter for the Frumentari. These weren't ordinary soldiers, they were Rome's intelligence operatives. The Frumentari started as military supply officers but evolved into the emperor's secret service. They gathered intelligence across the empire, from Britannia to Egypt, operating in foreign territories much like modern CIA agents. The Castra Peregrina was their headquarters, right here on Caelian Hill. From this base, they coordinated operations across the empire, processed intelligence, and prepared briefings for the emperor. Their power was controversial, though. Known for brutal methods, they were eventually disbanded in the 3rd century AD. But their presence here reminds us that Caelian Hill wasn't just home to luxury villas. It was also a centre of imperial power and covert operations. Today, Caelian Hill is a peaceful residential area, a historical public park, several beautiful churches and ancient ruins. It's a far cry from the luxurious neighbourhood it once was, but memories of its past can still be seen in the fragments of villas, the remains of temples and the beauty of its early churches. As we bid farewell to Caelian Hill's luxury and intrigue, let's journey to a place that truly embodies the phrase, "from rags to riches." Esquiline Hill is the ultimate comeback story for a hill. Imagine a place that goes from being the city dump and burial ground for the despised to hosting one of the most luxurious palaces in history. In the early days of Rome, this wasn't exactly sought-after real estate. It was where executed and enemies of the state were dumped, their bodies left exposed as a warning to others. It was also where the poor were buried, and where much of the city's garbage ended up. In other words, a landscape avoided by most Romans and associated with death and decay. Imagine this. It's night. The air is thick with the stench of decay. Shadowy figures move among the graves, body snatchers and witches seeking ingredients for their dark arts. This was the Esquiline Hill that the ancient Roman poet Horace wrote about, a place of death, nightmares and dark magic. But then came a man with a vision, and that man was Caesar Augustus's advisor, Maecenas, who saw potential where others saw gloom. Maecenas decided it was time for a makeover, so to speak. He covered the old burial grounds and dump sites with clean soil and transformed the area into a series of beautiful public gardens. Soon, Esquiline Hill went from being the place you avoided to a place of beauty. But the real change came with Emperor Nero. After the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, Nero saw an opportunity. He said, "Out with the old, in with the gold," or something along those lines, and built his famous golden house, or Domus Aurea, right here on Esquiline Hill. Nero's palace was so vast it covered parts of 3 hills, with 100 feet, or 30.5 metre, high statue of himself at the entrance. It included extensive gardens, pavilions, and an artificial lake. The palace itself had a mechanically rotating dining room, fountains that sprayed perfume, and ceilings that showered guests with flower petals. But Nero's extravagance didn't last. After his death, much of the Domus Aurea was filled in and built over. Later, the Colosseum was built where Nero's artificial lake had been, and the baths of Trajan were constructed over parts of the Domus Aurea. I think Esquiline Hill teaches us an important lesson that I, personally, have benefited greatly from, that today's trash heap can become tomorrow's treasure. Now, let's descend from the heights of imperial excess to the heart of everyday Roman life. Viminal Hill might be the smallest of Rome's 7 hills, and it often gets overshadowed by its more famous siblings. But don't let its size fool you. This little hill was an important spot in ancient Roman life. Viminal Hill was home to a bustling community of artisans and craftsmen. Imagine walking down these streets in ancient times. The air would be filled with the sounds of hammering, the smell of fresh bread, and the chatter of shopkeepers. It was basically the heart of Rome's small but important middle class. Picture a narrow street lined with workshops and small homes. A blacksmith hammers out a sword while next door. A potter shapes clay into elegant vases. Further down, a baker pulls fresh loaves from an oven, filling the air with the irresistible aroma of newly baked bread. But Viminal Hill wasn't just about craft and commerce. It also played a crucial role in Rome's administration and security. An architectural jewel of Viminal Hill was the Baths of Diocletian. These were the largest of the imperial baths in Rome. This complex is said to have been able to accommodate up to 3,000 people at once, covering an area of about 32 acres or 13 hectares. Like the other baths, this wasn't just for bathing, it was a social hub, a place for exercise, relaxation, and even intellectual pursuits. Picture yourself walking into a grand hall, its ceiling soaring high above you. To one side, scholars debate morality and ethics in the library. To another, athletes prepare for a wrestling match. And in the centre, Romans from all walks of life mingle in the warm waters, gossiping about the latest political scandals or discussing business deals. Viminal was also home to the Vicus Patricius, one of the most important streets in ancient Rome. This road ran along the western slope of the hill, and it was one of the primary thoroughfares connecting various parts of the city, facilitating movement and commerce. The street was known for its residential buildings, which housed members of the Roman elite as well as ordinary citizens. The area was also home to various shops, taverns, and other establishments that catered to the daily needs of the inhabitants. So while Viminal Hill might not have the famous legends of Palatine or the grand temples of Capitoline, it offers us something equally valuable, a glimpse into the everyday life of ancient Rome. It reminds us that great civilizations are built not just on soldiers and grand monuments, but on the ordinary people going about their daily business. As we leave the bustling streets of Viminal, let's ascend to our final destination, where the air is cooler and the views are fit for gods and kings. From the bustling artisan quarters of Viminal Hill, we now ascend to the serene heights of the final hill, the ideal getaway location for those who can afford it. Quirinal Hill is the highest of Rome's 7 hills, and it has a story that begins with drama and ends with prestige. According to legend, in the very early days of Rome, this tiny group of male settlers were desperate for wives. After all, who would marry off their daughters to a gang of unruly men on a hill? So as you do when you get rejected, Romulus and his men abducted women from the neighbouring Sabine tribe. Conflict erupts, but the Sabine women themselves broker a peace. The result is a somewhat united people, with Romulus and the Sabine king, Titus Tatius, ruling jointly. Titus Tatius and many of his people settled here on Quirinal Hill, bringing their customs and gods. In fact, the hill takes its name from the Sabine god Quirinus, later associated with the deified Romulus. As Rome grew, Quirinal Hill became the ideal getaway for the city's elite. Its height and northern location offered beautiful views and a peaceful environment. So Rome's wealthy built vacation homes here, seeking luxury and peace away from the noisy city centre, but still within easy reach. There would have been elegant villas dotting the hillside, their terraces offering panoramic views of the city. But Quirinal wasn't only for relaxation. It hosted important religious sites too, like the Temple of Quirinus. Of course, the hill was frequently used for religious festivals and public gatherings. Over time, more temples and public buildings sprang up, cementing Quirinal's status as a key area in Rome. To this day, Quirinal Hill still exudes power and prestige. This impressive construction is the Quirinal Palace, now one of 3 residences to the Italian president. While this building came much later, its location speaks to the hill's continued importance. And there you have it, the 7 hills of Rome. From the legendary twins nursed by a wolf to the palaces of emperors, from the birthplace of people power to the home of modern-day presidents, these hills have seen it all. They've witnessed the birth of republics, the rise and fall of empires, and the evolution of Western civilization. They've been home to gods and mortals, slaves and emperors, artisans and aristocrats. But most importantly, they remind us that history isn't just something that happened long ago. It never stops, and you are part of making the history that will one day be considered ancient. And whether you're standing on the hills of Rome or the streets of your hometown, you're standing on layers of history. If you enjoyed this journey through the 7 hills of Rome, please consider joining our Patreon. Your support helps us continue to create more videos exploring fascinating historical topics. Thank you for watching.